I never thought I'd be buying back my own life at 67. The morning I discovered my late husband's memorial plaque missing from Willow Bloom's legacy wall, I was arranging white lily in the same crystal vase I'd used for 40 years of teaching, 25 years of marriage, one devoted son, and a business I'd helped birth with my teacher's pension. All of it suddenly erased by my daughter-in-law's rebranding vision. "We need more space for the new seasonal displays," Brielle had explained, her voice smooth as silk and twice as cold. The plaque now sat in a storage box like discarded homework. But what she didn't know was that I still held the original investment documents. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent of eucalyptus and old memories filled my lungs as I stood in the doorway of Willow Bloom that Tuesday morning, watching Brielle rearrange the front display with the precision of a general positioning troops. She moved with practiced efficiency, her auburn hair swept into a perfect chignon, her designer apron spotless despite an hour of heavy lifting. Everything about my daughter-in-law screamed success, from her manicured nails to her carefully curated Instagram presence that had tripled the shop's online following. I remembered when she first walked into our lives 8 years ago, all ambitious smiles and grand plans. Theo had been smitten from their first coffee date, and honestly, so had I. She possessed a drive I recognized, the same hunger for purpose that had once propelled me through graduate school while teaching full-time and raising my son as a single mother for those early years when my husband traveled constantly for work. "Good morning, Eliza," Brielle called without looking up from the sunflower arrangement she was critiquing. "I moved your little herb corner to make room for the new autumn centerpieces. Hope you don't mind. My little herb corner," the words stung more than they should have. That little corner had been my pride for 3 years, a carefully curated selection of culinary herbs and medicinal plants that drew customers who remembered when their grandmothers grew such things. I'd researched each variety, written detailed care cards by hand, and spent countless hours answering questions about everything from growing mint to harvesting lavender. "Of course," I replied, forcing warmth into my voice. "Where did you relocate?" I consolidated everything into that back area near the storage room. Much more organized now. She finally turned to face me, her smile bright but somehow not reaching her eyes. "Actually, I'm glad you're here early. I wanted to discuss the holiday planning meeting with the investors this afternoon." Investors, another new addition to Brielle's vocabulary. When Theo and Brielle had first approached me about funding their dream of expanding my husband Robert's small garden centre into a full lifestyle boutique, it had been a family affair. I'd liquidated my teacher's retirement account, added my own savings, and even contributed my late mother's antique furniture for the shop's decor. The legal paperwork had been rushed grief, and hope make poor bedfellows when it comes to business decisions, but I'd trusted them implicitly. "I wasn't aware there was a meeting," I said carefully. "Last-minute thing. Marcus Webb from Pacific Coastal Development wants to discuss the expansion loan. Very exciting stuff, but probably not your cup of tea. You know how these financial discussions can get." The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable. I'd been handling school budgets for decades, had managed complex district finances, and had personally overseen the renovation of 3 different school buildings. But somehow, in Brielle's world, I'd become too delicate for business talk. "I see." I moved toward the back of the store, ostensibly to check on my relocated herbs, but really to give myself space to breathe. The morning light filtered through the large windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above displays of artisanal soaps and locally made candles. This place had become beautiful under Brielle's vision. I couldn't deny that. But beautiful, in the way that magazine photos are beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and somehow empty of the warmth that once made customers linger for conversation. I found my herbs crammed onto 2 small shelves near the employee bathroom. They're hand-lettered. Signs looking shabby next to Brielle's printed labels with their modern fonts and QR codes linking to care videos. My throat tightened. These plants represented more than just products, they were connections to customers who'd become friends, conversations that had grown into relationships, the slow building of community that I'd always believed was the heart of any good business. Mrs. Marlowe. Jazz's voice interrupted my melancholy inventory. Jasmine Cortez had been working at the shop for 3 years, ever since graduating from the local community college with a degree in horticulture. At 25, she possessed an easy confidence I envied and a laugh that could brighten even Oregon's greyest days. More importantly, she was one of the few people who still seemed to see me as relevant. "Good morning, dear." I turned to find her carrying a steaming mug of what smelled like a signature lavender tea blend. "Thought you might need this." She pressed the warm ceramic into my hands. "Saw the great herb relocation project. Real shame about the prime real estate." Her tone was light, but I caught the underlying frustration. Jazz had helped me build that herb section, had seen how customers responded to the personal touch, the stories behind each plant. She understood what was being lost in the name of optimization. "Change is inevitable," I said, echoing the phrase I'd used countless times when comforting students facing difficult transitions. Sure, but so is standing up for what matters. Jazz's dark eyes met mine with an intensity that reminded me why I'd always gravitated toward bright, determined young women. "You know, my grandmother always said that the strongest plants are the ones that know when to put down deeper roots and when to find new soil." Before I could respond, Brielle's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Jazz, could you help me with the window display? And Eliza, don't forget about the supply closet reorganization we discussed. The new system should make inventory much more efficient." Supply closet reorganization. Another project designed to keep me busy and out of the way while real decisions were made without me. I sipped Jazz's tea and tasted the familiar bite of rebellion that had once driven me to challenge school board policies and fight for innovative programs. That same fire had been dormant for too long, banked under layers of grief and the gradual erosion of my confidence. As I watched Brielle direct Jazz with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, I thought about the woman I used to be, Principal Marlowe, who'd stood before hostile parent meetings and defended progressive teaching methods, who'd fought for funding for arts programs and won, who'd never backed down from a challenge when she knew she was right. That woman wouldn't have been relocated to a storage closet. The bell above the front door chimed, and our first customer of the day entered, Mrs. Patterson, a regular who'd been coming for my herb recommendations since the shop opened. She looked around uncertainly, clearly searching for the familiar corner where we'd had so many conversations about her battle with insomnia and her experiments with chamomile tea. "Excuse me," she called to Brielle. "Where did the herbs go?" I was hoping to find Eliza. I started to step forward, but Brielle was already moving toward Mrs. Patterson with her practiced customer service smile. "I can help you with whatever you need. We've reorganized for better efficiency." "What were you looking for specifically?" "Well, Eliza had recommended this blend for sleep, and I wanted to try something similar for my arthritis." I watched Mrs. Patterson's face as Brielle launched into a polished but impersonal recitation of our current herbal offerings. The older woman nodded politely, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes, the loss of connection, of being seen and remembered as more than just another transaction. This was what was being optimized away. The conversations that turn customers into community members. The relationships that made a small business more than just another place to spend money. The human element that no amount of social media followers could replace. As Mrs. Patterson Left with the generic lavender sachet instead of the personalized blend I would have created for her, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wouldn't be reorganizing any supply closets today. Instead, I was going to make some phone calls. Starting with my old friend Marion, who'd handled enough family business disputes in her 30-year legal career to know exactly what questions I should be asking about those original investment documents. The fire that had been dormant was beginning to spark again, and I had a feeling Brielle had no idea what she'd awakened when she moved my husband's memorial plaque to a storage box. Some lessons, I reflected as I headed toward my car, I'll only learn the hard way. The call from Theo came at exactly 3:47 p.m., interrupting my afternoon tea and the mystery novel I'd been trying to lose myself in since returning from the shop. His voice carried that careful tone he'd perfected over the years, the one that meant he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like. "Mom, we need to talk about the investor meeting." I marked my place in the book and settled deeper into Robert's old armchair, the leather still holding the faint scent of his cologne after 6 months. I gathered there were some developments since I wasn't invited. It wasn't intentional. "Brielle thought you might find it stressful, given everything you've been dealing with since Dad passed." The careful phrasing rang cold. Everything I'd been dealing with, as if grief were a temporary condition that made me unfit for normal adult responsibilities. What decisions were made without my input? Theo's sigh carried clearly through the phone. Marcus Webb approved the expansion loan. "We're going to be able to renovate the entire back section, add a cafe area, maybe even expand into the adjacent storefront." I should have felt excited. This was growth, opportunity, the kind of success any investor would celebrate. Instead, a cold knot formed in my stomach. And my contribution to these plans? Well, that's the thing. Webb wants to streamline the ownership structure, make it cleaner for future investments. Brielle's been handling all the day-to-day operations anyway, and with your ... situation, it might be better if we bought out your initial investment, give you some liquid assets for your retirement. My situation. As if being a widow at 67 automatically made me incompetent. As if the 40-year career I'd built meant nothing when measured against Brielle's 3 years of Instagram success. How much are they offering? I kept my voice level, though my knuckles were white around the phone. "It's very generous, Mom, twice your original investment, plus a percentage of the projected growth over the next 5 years. You'd be completely taken care of. Like an aging pet being pensioned off to a comfortable retirement." I closed my eyes and saw Mrs. Patterson's disappointed face again. Remembered the careful way Brielle had redirected every attempt I'd made to contribute to shop decisions over the past months. "I need to think about it, of course." "Take your time, but Mom," Theo's voice softened. "This could be really good for all of us. You wouldn't have to worry about the business stress anymore. You could travel, maybe take those art classes you used to talk about. Enjoy your golden years. Another phrase designed to make my life sound like a pleasant epilogue rather than an ongoing story. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering twilight, watching shadows lengthen across the garden Robert and I had planned together, the irises he'd planted the year before his heart attack was still blooming, purple and white spears of defiance against the advancing autumn. I thought about the morning's events with new clarity. The corner relegated to a back shelf. The memorial plaque stored away, my exclusion from important meetings. It wasn't a series of thoughtless oversights, it was a systematic campaign to make me irrelevant in my own investment. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted my brooding. Through the front window, I saw Marion's silver Subaru pulling into my driveway. My oldest friend emerged with characteristic purposefulness, carrying what looked like a bottle of wine and a manila folder thick with documents. "I got your message," she announced as I opened the door. And I brought reinforcements. She held up the wine, a good Pinot Noir from a local vineyard. Plus some bedtime reading that might interest you. We settled in my kitchen, the same space, where we planned debate strategies in high school, where she'd help me practice for job interviews, where we toasted every major life milestone for nearly 50 years. Marion poured wine while I described the day's revelations. Streamlining ownership, she repeated with the sharp tone she'd once used to demolish opposing counsel. How convenient for them. Theo makes it sound like charity, taking the burden off my shoulders. Theo's always been conflict averse, even as a child. Remember when you let Tommy Morrison take credit for his science fair project because he didn't want to make waves? Marion opened the folder and spread documents across. My kitchen table, these are the original investment agreements you signed. I had to call in a favour to get copies from the county recorder's office. I leaned forward, squinting at the legal language I'd barely understood 3 years ago. Grief and hope, as I'd noted earlier, made terrible business partners. What am I looking at? Your signature on a document that makes you a 40% owner of Willow and Bloom, LLC. Theo and Brielle each hold 30%. Her finger traced a line of text. Here's the interesting part: any major business decisions, including changes to ownership structure, require unanimous consent from all parties holding more than 20%. The words swam before my eyes as their implications sank in. They can't buy me out without my agreement, correct? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Marion flipped to another page. According to this clause, if any owner wishes to sell their stake, the other owners have right of first refusal. But, and this is crucial, it also works in reverse. If you wanted to buy additional shares, you'd have priority over outside investors. I stared at the document, seeing not just legal language, but possibilities I hadn't considered. How would that work practically? Well, hypothetically, if someone were to default on their obligations to the business, say, by making unauthorized structural changes or excluding a major investor from key decisions, it could constitute breach of the operating agreement. In such cases, the injured party might have grounds to demand remedy, including forced sale of shares. Marion's lawyer voice was in full effect now, precise and devastating. I could see why she'd been so successful in family court. Are you suggesting I could force them to sell to me? I'm suggesting you have more options than they're presenting. The question is whether you want to use them. I took a sip of wine and considered the question seriously. Did I want to fight? For months, I'd been drifting, letting grief and uncertainty guide my decisions. I'd stepped back from the business, from social obligations, from anything that required me to be the strong, decisive woman I'd once been. It had seemed easier to let others take charge while I navigated the strange new landscape of widowhood. But sitting in my kitchen with legal documents spread before me and my oldest friend waiting for my answer, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced since Robert's funeral. Not just anger, though that was certainly present. Not just hurt, though Brielle's casual dismissals had cut deeper than I'd admitted. What I felt was the return of appetite, hunger for agency, for purpose, for the satisfaction of building something meaningful. Tell me more about my options, I said. Marion smiled, and for a moment I saw the 17-year-old debate champion who demolished our competition with surgical precision. First, we document everything, every decision made without your input, every change to the business operations, every instance where your rights as an investor were ignored. Then we make a choice, negotiate from strength, or go nuclear. Buy them out instead of letting them buy you out. Take control of the business you helped create. The idea was so audacious it took my breath away. At 67, with no recent business experience beyond school administration, the thought of actually running Willow and Bloom seemed impossible. But as I imagined walking into the shop as the majority owner, rather than the inconvenient widow being gently pushed toward the exit, something long dormant began to wake up. I'd need to understand the finances completely. The real numbers, not just the sanitized version they've been sharing. I can help with that. My retirement hobby is forensic accounting. Turns out those skills translate beautifully to mystery writing. Marion refilled our glasses. The question is, are you ready to stop being the grieving widow they want you to be and start being the force of nature I remember? I thought about Mrs. Patterson's disappointed face, about my herbs relegated to a back corner, about Robert's memorial plaque sitting in a storage box like discarded history, about all the careful ways I'd been made to feel irrelevant in my own life. Yes, I said, and the word felt like striking a match in the darkness. I think I am. As Marion began explaining the process of conducting due diligence on my own investment, I realized this wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about reclaiming the person I'd been before grief and good manners had convinced me to make myself smaller. It was about showing my son that respect isn't something you give up just because you've experienced loss. And yes, it was about proving to my daughter-in-law that underestimating a retired school principal was a mistake she'd only make once. The golden years, I reflected with growing satisfaction, were about to become much more interesting than anyone had planned. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a masterclass in covert operations. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed research, the systematic gathering of information that had once made me such an effective educator. Now I applied those same skills to understanding every aspect of the business I'd helped fund, but never truly controlled. My days developed a careful rhythm. Mornings at the shop, playing the role of the helpful but peripheral investor, observing interactions and noting inconsistencies. Afternoons, with Marion, poring over financial documents and building what she cheerfully called our case file. Evenings alone with spreadsheets and a growing sense of clarity about exactly how thoroughly I'd been marginalized. The first revelation came through Jazz, who'd begun stopping by my house after work under the pretense of checking on my herb garden. She possessed that particular Gen Z talent for noticing things older generations missed, and her observations were illuminating. Did you know Brielle's been telling the wholesale suppliers that she's the sole owner? Jazz mentioned casually while helping me harvest late-season tomatoes. I was there when she called about the holiday order. Kept saying my business and my vision, never mentioned partners. I paused in my picking. You're certain, Joe? Yeah. And there's more. She's been having meetings with that web guy after hours. I saw them last Tuesday night when I came back from my sweater. They were going through files in your husband's old office, and she was showing him plans I'd never seen before. The office that had once been Robert's sanctuary, where he'd kept his gardening journals and planned seasonal displays, had been converted into Brielle's private workspace months ago. I'd accepted the change as practical, the widow ceding space to the active manager. Now I wondered what else I'd accepted without question. What kind of plans? Big ones, looked like architectural drawings, maybe for the whole block. Way bigger than just expanding the cafe area. That evening, I shared this information with Marion over dinner at her house, a cozy cottage overlooking the bay where she'd lived since her own husband's death 5 years earlier. Her response was characteristically direct. She's positioning herself as the sole owner to external parties while using your investment capital for expansion. Classic case of financial misrepresentation. Marion's fingers drummed against her wine glass. The question is whether she's doing it deliberately or if she's just gotten sloppy because no one's been paying attention. Does it matter for legal purposes? Intent matters. For practical purposes, not so much. Either way, she's breaching the operating agreement. Marion pulled out her laptop. I've been running some numbers based on the financial reports you got from Theo. Want to see something interesting? The spreadsheet she showed me revealed a pattern I'd been too trusting to notice. Over the past 18 months, Brielle had systematically redirected customer relationships away from personal service toward digital engagement. The consultations that had been my specialty were replaced by QR codes linking to generic care videos. The custom arrangements that had built the shop's reputation were streamlined into preset options that could be fulfilled by any employee. She's been depersonalizing the business, I realized, making it scalable. Exactly. Which is smart if you're planning to franchise or sell to a larger chain. But it fundamentally changes what you invested in. Marion highlighted another column. Look at the profit margins. They've improved dramatically, but at the cost of customer retention. Repeat business is down 23% over the past year. I thought about Mrs. Patterson and the dozen other regular customers who'd stopped coming in as frequently. I'd attributed their absence to natural changes in shopping patterns, but the data told a different story. We were losing the relationships that had made Willow and Bloom more than just another lifestyle boutique. She's preparing to sell, I said with sudden certainty. That would be my guess. Strip out the personal elements that can't be replicated. Standardize operations, and maximize short-term profits to make the business attractive to corporate buyers. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. Not just the financial impropriety, but the deliberate destruction of everything Robert and I had envisioned when we'd agreed to fund their dream. We'd imagined a place that would be part of the community, where people could find not just products, but connection. Brielle was systematically erasing that vision in favor of something more profitable, but infinitely less meaningful. I want to buy her out, I said, all of it. Her shares and Theo's if necessary. Marion nodded as if she'd been waiting for this decision. I've been working on that scenario. Based on the current valuation and expansion projections, you'd need about $400,000 to acquire controlling interest. More if you want to buy them out completely, $400,000, more than I'd ever spent on anything except the house Robert and I had bought 30 years ago. But I'd been careful with money my entire life, and Robert's life insurance had been generous. I had the resources. If I was willing to use them, what would be my first step? Due diligence. We need an independent assessment of the business value, a complete audit of the books, and documentation of every decision made without your input. Marion's smile was sharp with anticipation. I know just the person for the job. The person turned out to be Harper Lynn, a business consultant who specialized in helping women acquire companies in traditionally male-dominated industries. At 42, Harper had the kind of quiet competence I recognized from my teaching days, the ability to see patterns others missed and ask questions that revealed uncomfortable truths. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, far enough from Willow and Bloom to avoid unwanted attention. Harper reviewed my documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen similar situations before. Family business disputes are tricky, she said, after an hour of note-taking. Emotions run high, and people often make decisions based on relationships rather than facts. But from what you're showing me, you have significant leverage. Your daughter-in-law has been operating as if she owns the business outright, but legally she doesn't. She's made commitments to lenders and investors based on an authority she doesn't actually possess. That puts her in a vulnerable position. Harper outlined a strategy that was both elegant and ruthless. Rather than confronting Brielle directly, we would conduct a thorough business assessment under the guise of updating my estate planning. The audit would reveal any financial irregularities while giving me complete information about the company's true value and prospects. Once we have the full picture, you'll be in a position to make an informed offer for additional shares, Harper explained. If they refuse, you can use the operating agreement violations to force the issue. If they accept, you gain control on your terms. It was a plan that appealed to my educator's love of preparation and my administrator's appreciation for systematic approaches to complex problems. More importantly, it felt like a way to honor Robert's memory while reclaiming my own agency. The hardest part would be maintaining the pretense of casual interest while conducting what amounted to corporate espionage on my own family. But I'd spent decades managing difficult personalities and navigating political situations in the school system. These skills, I was discovering, translated remarkably well to business warfare. That night, I called Theo to arrange a family dinner for the following Sunday. My tone was carefully neutral, the voice of a mother seeking connection rather than our investor planning a takeover. I've been thinking about what you said, I told him. About my situation and the business changes. I'd like to understand everything better before making any decisions. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Of course, Mum, that's really wise. Brielle will be so pleased that you're taking time to consider all the options. Brielle would indeed be pleased, I reflected after hanging up. She'd see my request for information as confirmation that she'd successfully positioned me as the anxious widow seeking reassurance about her financial future. She wouldn't suspect that I was actually conducting reconnaissance for a hostile takeover dart. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me had changed over the past month. The uncertain, grieving widow was still there, but she was sharing space with someone more familiar, the principal who'd never backed down from a challenge, the teacher who'd fought for her students, the woman who'd built a life and career through determination and strategic thinking. Tomorrow I would begin the careful work of reclaiming my business and my dignity. But tonight, for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like myself again. The golden years I was beginning to understand weren't about retirement from life's challenges. They were about choosing which battles were worth fighting and bringing a lifetime of experience to the conflict. And I had a feeling that Brielle was about to discover that underestimating a woman with 40 years of leadership experience was a mistake, with expensive consequences. The family dinner took place on a grey October Sunday, the kind of day that made indoor gatherings feel particularly cozy. I'd prepared Robert's favourite part roast, knowing that familiar comfort foods would help maintain the illusion of a grandmother. Seeking family counsel rather than a strategist gathering intelligence, Theo arrived first, carrying flowers from the shop, a mixed bouquet that showed Brielle's improved aesthetic sense but lacked the personal touch I would have added. He looked tired, I noticed, with the particular exhaustion that comes from avoiding difficult conversations. My son had inherited his father's conflict-averse nature, but where Robert had channeled that tendency into patient diplomacy, Theo simply withdrew. "The house smells amazing," he said, embracing me with the careful attention of someone performing duty rather than expressing spontaneous affection. Just like when Dad was ... He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Everything these days was measured against the absence Robert had left behind. The empty chair at the dinner table, the silence where his laughter used to fill awkward pauses, the way conversations now had to navigate around the space he'd occupied in all our lives. Brielle arrived 20 minutes later, apologizing profusely for her delay while simultaneously checking her phone. She'd dressed for the occasion in a way that managed to be both respectful and subtly dominant, a cream-coloured cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, paired with perfectly pressed slacks and shoes that clicked authoritatively against my hardwood floors. "Eliza, you look wonderful," she said, kissing my cheek with practiced warmth. "That colour is so flattering on you. Very youthful. Very youthful." Another of those carefully chosen phrases that seemed complimentary while actually emphasizing age. and the assumption of diminished capacity that came with it. I was beginning to catalogue these linguistic microaggressions with the same attention I'd once paid to subtle forms of classroom disruption. Over dinner, I played my role perfectly, the concerned widow seeking guidance about complex financial matters. I asked questions about the expansion plans, the new investors, the projected timeline for growth. Brielle answered with the patient tone one might use with a bright child who was trying to understand adult concepts. The retail landscape is changing so rapidly, she explained, cutting her meat into precise, identical pieces. What worked even 5 years ago just isn't sustainable anymore. We have to think bigger, be more strategic about scalability and brand development, I see, and the personal service elements that Robert valued so much. Oh, we're not abandoning those entirely. We're just finding more efficient ways to deliver them. The consultation videos have been incredibly popular. We've had over 10,000 views on YouTube. Much better reach than individual conversations. 10,000 views versus the dozen meaningful relationships I'd built through those individual conversations. I began to understand the philosophical chasm that separated Brielle's vision from my own. She measured success in metrics that could be quantified and scaled. I valued connections that were inherently unscalable because they depended on human recognition and response. The numbers are really impressive, Theo added, clearly trying to bridge what he sensed was becoming a difficult conversation. The profit margins have improved dramatically since Brielle implemented the new systems. I'm sure they have. I smiled with what I hoped looked like maternal pride, rather than strategic assessment. It sounds like you've built something quite different from what Robert and I originally envisioned. Evolution is natural in business, Brielle said smoothly. The foundation you and Robert provided was wonderful, but foundations are meant to be built upon, not preserved exactly as they were. After dinner, while Theo helped with dishes and made carefully neutral conversation about the weather and local news, Brielle and I found ourselves alone in the living room. This felt like an opportunity for the kind of direct conversation we'd been dancing around for months. I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for the business, I began, settling into Robert's chair, while she perched on the edge of the sofa like someone prepared for quick departure. Of course, your initial investment made everything possible. Initial investment, that's an interesting way to phrase it. I've been thinking of it more as an ongoing partnership. Something shifted in Brielle's expression, a tight unning around her eyes that suggested I'd move beyond the script she'd prepared for this conversation. Well, naturally, though with your recent loss and everything you're dealing with, we've tried to handle the day-to-day operations without burdening you, and I've appreciated that consideration. Though I'm beginning to wonder if I've been too passive about staying involved in decisions that affect my investment. What kind of decisions? The expansion loan, for instance. Or the changes to the shop's layout and product mix. Or the discussions with potential investors about future ownership structure. Now Brielle's mask slipped entirely, revealing the sharp calculation I'd glimpsed occasionally over the past 3 years but had always chosen to overlook. Eliza, I think there might be some misunderstanding about your role in the business. Theo and I handle operations. You're more of a silent partner. There it was, finally spoken aloud, the role they'd decided I should play, without ever asking if I agreed to it. The grieving widow, grateful for their management of her little investment, content to collect modest returns while the real work of building something significant was handled by more capable hands. I see. And this silent partnership was that outlined in our original agreement. Not explicitly, but given the circumstances... I'd like to review those circumstances, I said gently. Along with our original agreement and the current financial status of the business, for my estate planning, you understand. I want to make sure everything is properly documented, of course. Though I should mention that Marcus Webb has been very interested in streamlining our ownership structure. He thinks it would make future investments much simpler if we consolidated management authority. How thoughtful of him. I look forward to hearing more about his proposals. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting where all the partners can discuss these options together. I'll talk to Theo about setting something up. But even as she agreed, I could see the wheels turning behind her. Carefully controlled expression. She was recalculating, trying to determine how much of a threat I actually posed to the plans that had clearly been in motion for months without my knowledge. After they left, I called Marion to report on the evening's intelligence gathering. Her response was predictably direct. "She's scared," Marion announced after I'd related the conversation. All that talk about streamlining and silent partnerships, she knows she's been operating outside the legal agreement. And now she's trying to retroactively justify it. The question is what she do next. Depends how smart she is. If she's really smart, she'd try to negotiate a fair buyout that gives you some dignity while preserving her control. If she's arrogant... Marion paused. Well, arrogant people tend to make mistakes that work in our favor. The next morning brought my answer. I arrived at the shop to find Jazz waiting by the employee entrance, her usual bright energy replaced by obvious distress. "Mrs. Marlowe, I'm so sorry." I tried to stop her, but she said it was a management decision. Inside, I discovered that my herbs section had been eliminated entirely. The plants had been donated to a local community garden, Jazz informed me, and the space converted to display autumn decorations sourced from a wholesale supplier in Port Lund. Professional, profitable, and utterly impersonal, but it was the note left on what had once been my workspace that truly revealed Brielle's hand. Written in her precise handwriting, it read, "Eliza thought this transition might be easier while you weren't here." The community garden was thrilled to receive the herbs, and the new display will be much more efficient to maintain. Looking forward to our conversation about your future role. Be your future role. Not our partnership, not collaborative planning, but a role she would define and I would be expected to accept. It was the final piece of evidence I needed to move forward with complete confidence in my decision. That afternoon, I called Harper Lynn and told her to proceed with the full business assessment. I also instructed Marion to prepare the legal groundwork for acquiring additional shares in Willow Bloom, LLC. How aggressive do you want to be? Marion asked. I thought about Mrs. Patterson's disappointed face, about my herbs banished to her community garden, about Robert's memorial plaque sitting in a storage box while Brielle rebranded our dream into something profitable but soulless. As aggressive as necessary, I said. I'm done being the silent partner. The war for Willow Bloom was officially beginning, and I intended to win it decisively. After all, I'd spent 40 years teaching young people that respect wasn't something you could demand, it was something you earned through consistent action and clear boundaries. Brielle was about to receive a master class in both. The call came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, jarring me from the deep sleep that had finally become possible again after months of restless nights. Harper Lynn's voice was tight with urgency. Eliza, we need to meet immediately. I've found something in the business audit that changes everything. An hour later, I sat across from Harper in the same coffee shop where we'd first discussed my situation. But this time, she'd spread documents across the table with the grim efficiency of someone delivering devastating news. Her usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the kind of controlled anger I recognized from my own experiences with institutional betrayal. I need you to prepare yourself, she began. What I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to hear. The first document was a bank statement. I'd never seen before an account opened in Willow Bloom's name, but requiring only Brielle's signature for transactions. Over the past 18 months, she'd systematically diverted nearly $60,000 dollars from the main business account into this secondary fund. Is this legal? I asked, though the sick feeling in my stomach already suggested the answer, absolutely not. She's listed as the sole account holder despite not being the sole owner of the business. Any commingling of funds like this requires unanimous approval from all partners. Harper flipped to another page. But that's not the worst part. The second revelation was a consulting contract between Brielle and Marcus Webb's development company, dated 6 months earlier. According to the terms, she was receiving a monthly fee of $5,000 to facilitate acquisition opportunities related to the Willow and Bloom property and business. She's been paid to sell us out, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Effectively, yes. Webb's company specializes in assembling retail properties for redevelopment. They've been quietly purchasing businesses along this entire block, waiting for the right moment to approach the city about rezoning for high-density housing. I stared at the contract, trying to process the scope of the betrayal. Not only had Brielle been systematically marginalizing me from the business I'd helped fund, she'd been actively working to eliminate it entirely, the expansion plans, the streamlined operations, the focus on scalability, all of it had been preparation for selling to a developer who planned to tear down everything Robert and I had envisioned. There's more, Harper said gently. I found correspondence between Brielle and Webb discussing timeline for your removal. From the business structure, she's been telling him that you're elderly and confused, that buying you out would be a formality once you understood the complexity of modern business operations. Elderly and confused. The words hit like a physical blow. I thought of all the times Brielle had spoken to me with patient condescension, all the decisions made for my own good, all the careful ways she'd positioned herself as the competent young woman managing the affairs of her befuddled mother-in-law. How long has this been going on? The consulting contract started right after your husband's funeral. I think she saw his death as an opportunity to restructure the business without interference. The timing made horrible sense. In the immediate aftermath of losing Robert, I'd been grateful for Brielle's willingness to handle the day-to-day operations of the shop. I'd interpreted her increased involvement as family support during a difficult time, never suspecting that she was actually positioning herself to eliminate my role entirely. What are my legal options? Harper's smile was sharp with anticipation. Multiple forms of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to defraud investors, and violation of the operating agreement. We have enough evidence to pursue both criminal charges and civil damages. More importantly, we have enough leverage to force them into whatever resolution you prefer. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what had been happening behind my carefully maintained facade of family harmony. For months, I'd been second-guessing my own perceptions, wondering if grief was making me overly sensitive to normal business changes. Now I understood that my instincts had been correct. I was being systematically eliminated from my own investment. I want to confront them, I said. But strategically, I want them to understand exactly how thoroughly they've underestimated. Emmy, what did you have in mind? The plan that emerged over the next hour was both elegant and devastating. Rather than approaching Brielle and Theo with accusations, I would let them believe their strategy was working. I would agree to their buyout proposal, but insist on a formal meeting with Marcus Webb to discuss the terms. Then, in that meeting, I would reveal that I knew about their secret arrangements and present them with a choice: sell me their shares immediately or face criminal charges for fraud. It's risky, Harper warned. If they refuse your offer, you'll have to follow through on the legal threats. I'm prepared for that. The certainty in my voice surprised me. They've been treating me like a helpless old woman who can be manipulated and discarded. I think it's time they learn the difference between being kind and being weak. That evening, I called Theo to arrange the meeting they'd been pushing for since our family dinner. I made sure to sound appropriately overwhelmed by the complexity of the business decisions I was facing. I've been thinking about what you and Brielle discussed, I told him. About the buyout offer and simplifying the ownership structure. I think I'm ready to move forward, but I'd like to meet with this Marcus Webb fellow to understand all the implications. That's wonderful, Mom. Really smart to get all the information before making such a big decision. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything important. You know how confused I get about financial matters. Of course. I'll have Brielle set something up for this week. Confused about financial matters. I'd never said anything of the sort, but it was clearly how my son had been encouraged to think about me. The realization was painful, but also liberating. I no longer had to worry about preserving family relationships that were apparently built on condescension and manipulation. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at Webb's office, a sleek space in a converted warehouse that screamed expensive success. I arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio that contained copies of all the evidence Harper had uncovered. To outside observers, I looked like exactly what they expected. A nicely dressed older woman out of her depth in complex business negotiations. Webb turned out to be a smooth, talking man in his 50s, with the kind of practiced charm that probably worked well on people who valued appearance over substance. He spent the first 10 minutes of our meeting explaining the benefits of liquidity and diversification in terms simple enough for a supposedly confused widow to understand. Brielle and Theo flanked him like supportive children helping an elderly parent navigate difficult decisions. Brielle's performance was particularly masterful, all concerned attention and gentle guidance as Webb outlined the generous terms of their buyout offer. $200,000 for your 40% stake, Webb concluded, plus a guaranteed annual payment of $12,000 for the next 5 years. You'd have no operational responsibilities, no risk exposure, and complete financial security. That sounds very generous, I said carefully. Though I have to admit, I'm a bit confused about some of the business arrangements I've been learning about. What kind of arrangements? Brielle's voice carried the slightest edge of tension. I opened my portfolio and removed the bank statements showing her unauthorized account. Well, for instance, I don't understand why there's a separate business account that requires only your signature. Could you explain how that works? The silence that followed was profound. Webb's practiced smile froze. Theo's face went pale, and Brielle's mask of concerned helpfulness slipped entirely. I think there's been some misunderstanding, she began. Oh, I don't think so. I placed the consulting contract on the conference table. I also don't understand why you've been receiving payments from Mr. Webb's company for the past 6 months. Could you help me understand what services you've been providing? Webb pushed back from the table slightly, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to defensive calculation. Mrs. Marlowe, I think there might be some confusion about standard business practices. I'm sure there is. For instance, I'm confused about whether conspiring to defraud investors constitutes a standard business practice in your industry. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Theo looked like he was going to be sick, while Brielle's face had gone completely white. Now, I continued pleasantly, I have a proposal that might resolve all this confusion. I'll purchase your combined 60% ownership for fair market value, let's say $600,000, and you can all move on to other opportunities. Or we can discuss this situation with the district attorney and see what they think about standard business practices. What followed was 30 minutes of the most satisfying negotiation of my life. Webb immediately distanced himself from any knowledge of improper financial arrangements. Theo appeared ready to agree to anything that would make the situation disappear. And Brielle finally showed me the sharp, desperate intelligence I'd always suspected lay beneath her carefully controlled surface. "You can't be serious," she said. "You don't know anything about running a modern business." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "I only know about running institutions that serve communities rather than exploiting them. I suspect I'll learn the rest as I go." In the end, they had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming, and the alternative to accepting my offer was legal and financial ruin. By the time we shook hands on the deal, I owned 100% of Willow Bloom, LLC. As I drove home that evening, I realized that everything had changed. I was no longer the silent partner being gently pushed toward irrelevance. I was no longer the grieving widow accepting guidance from more capable hands. I was the sole owner of a business with unlimited potential and the freedom to rebuild it according to my own vision. The golden years, I reflected with deep satisfaction, were going to be far more interesting than anyone had expected. The weekend following my acquisition of Willow Bloom passed in a blur of strategic planning and emotional processing. I found myself alternating between moments of exhilarating confidence and periods of genuine terror about what I'd committed myself to. Owning a business at 67 was one thing. Actually running it successfully was quite another. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzling, typical October weather that seemed to mirror my internal uncertainty. I dressed carefully in an navy blazer and comfortable slacks, professional enough to command respect, practical enough for the hands-on work I anticipated. As I drove to the shop, I rehearsed the speech I prepared for the staff meeting I'd scheduled. Jazz was already there when I arrived, arranging the front display with her usual creative flair. Her face lit up when she saw me, but I could detect underlying nervousness about the dramatic changes that were clearly coming. "Mrs. Marlowe, or should I say, boss?" She grinned, but the uncertainty in her voice was unmistakable. "Eliza is fine, just as it's always been." I hung my coat behind the counter and looked around the space with new eyes, no longer as an investor or silent partner, but as someone responsible for every decision that would determine its future. "How are you feeling about all this?" "Honestly, relieved and scared, but mostly relieved." Jazz set down the sunflowers she'd been arranging and faced me directly. Brielle was difficult to work for, especially these past few months. It was like she was preparing to burn everything down. In a sense, she was. I'll explain more when the others arrive. The rest of the staff trickled in over the next 30 minutes for part-time employees who'd been with the shop for various lengths of time, all looking nervous about the sudden change in ownership. I'd asked them to arrive an hour before normal opening time, knowing that difficult conversations were best handled without the distraction of customer service. When everyone was assembled in the back room that had once been Robert's office, I looked at the faces around me and felt the familiar weight of responsibility I remembered from my principal days. These people depended on this job for their livelihoods, and my decisions would directly impact their families and futures. "I want to start by assuring everyone that your positions are secure," I began. "The ownership change doesn't mean layoffs or dramatic operational shifts. What it does mean is that we're going to refocus on what made this business special in the first place." I outlined my vision for returning Willow Bloom to its community-centered roots while incorporating the operational improvements Brielle had implemented. The consultation program would return, but enhanced with the video resources that had proven popular. The custom arrangement services would be restored, but supported by the streamlined inventory systems that had improved efficiency. "I'm not interested in throwing away everything that's been built here," I explained, "but I am committed to rebuilding the personal connections that made this place matter to people." The response was better than I dared hope. Maya, who'd been handling the register for 2 years, admitted that she'd been looking for other work because the job had become just transactions instead of relationships. David, our weekend delivery driver, said he'd missed the stories customers used to share about their purchases, stories that had disappeared as the business became more impersonal. But it was Jazz's response that crystallized what I was trying to achieve. "It feels like we're getting the heart back," she said simply. After the staff meeting, I spent the morning walking through the shop with fresh eyes, making notes about changes I wanted to implement. The first priority was reclaiming the herb section that had been eliminated. The second was creating a space where customers could linger, perhaps a small seating area with books about gardening and local history, the kind of resource corner I'd always imagined but never had the authority to create. Around noon, Marion arrived with coffee and the legal documents finalizing my ownership transfer. She found me sitting in Robert's old chair behind the desk in what was now officially my office, staring at a stack of vendor catalogs and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd taken on. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Third and fourth thoughts. Maybe fifth." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "Do you think I'm completely insane?" "Absolutely. But the best decisions usually are completely insane from a conventional perspective." Marion's smile was warm with the affection of 50 years of friendship. "Besides, you've never been particularly conventional." She was right about that. I'd been the first in my family to attend college, the first woman principal in my district, the first to challenge policies that seemed unfair or outdated. Innovation had always required a willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something better. "Tell me about your immediate concerns," Marion continued. "What's keeping you awake at night?" "The financial projections, mainly." Brielle was right about the profit margins. Her systems did improve efficiency. "I'm worried that focusing on personal service will be less profitable in the short term and in the long term." I considered the question seriously. "In the long term, I think relationships are more sustainable than transactions. People can buy flowers anywhere, but they can't get the kind of personalized service and community connection I want to offer." "Then you have your answer. Build for the long term and trust that the short term will sort itself out." That afternoon brought my first real test as the new owner. Mrs. Patterson arrived looking for her usual herb consultation, having heard through the local grapevine that I was back in charge. She seemed tentative, uncertain whether the personalized service she'd valued would actually return. "I heard you're running things now," she said carefully. "Does that mean I might be able to get some help with this arthritis problem we discussed?" For the next 30 minutes, I worked with Mrs. Patterson to create a custom blend of anti-inflammatory herbs, explaining how each component would work and providing detailed instructions for preparation. It was exactly the kind of time-intensive, relationship-focused service that Brielle's efficiency models had eliminated. As Mrs. Patterson left with her personalized remedy and a promise to return in 2 weeks to discuss how it was working, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit margins. This was what I'd missed, the sense of being genuinely useful to another person, of applying knowledge and experience to solve real problems. But my satisfaction was short-lived. As I was closing up that evening, Theo arrived looking haggard and defensive. The confident young man who'd once excited me with his entrepreneurial dreams had been replaced by someone who seemed older than his 42 years. "Mom, we need to talk." I invited him into the office and watched as he struggled to find words for whatever he'd come to say. Finally, he managed to speak. "I didn't know about the secret account or the consulting contract. I swear to you, I had no idea what Brielle was doing behind the scenes. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of deception, but finding only genuine distress." "What did you know?" "I knew she thought you were too involved in day-to-day operations. She said it would be better for everyone if you could step back and enjoy retirement. I thought she was trying to protect you from stress and the expansion plans, the investor meetings I wasn't invited to. She said you found those discussions overwhelming." That you'd asked her to handle the business side so you could focus on grieving. Theo's voice broke slightly. I thought I was being a good son by supporting that. The pain in his voice was genuine, and I felt my anger toward him softening. Theo had always been susceptible to manipulation by stronger personalities, a trait that had worried me during his childhood and apparently hadn't improved with age. What happens now? He asked, with us. I know I can't undo what happened, but I need you to know that I never intended for you to be hurt. I considered his question carefully. Trust, once broken, couldn't be simply restored through good intentions. But family relationships were more complex than business partnerships, and I still love my son despite his failures of judgment. What happens now is that we rebuild, I said finally. Not just the business, but our relationship. That will require honesty from both of us about what went wrong and why. I'd like that, more than you know. Good, because I'm going to need help, and I'd rather have family involved than strangers, assuming you're willing to earn back my trust. The relief on Theo's face was profound. I'll do whatever it takes, then we start tomorrow. I want you here at 8 a.m., ready to learn what this business actually requires. No more delegating the difficult conversations or avoiding uncomfortable decisions. If you're going to be part of this, you're going to be fully present. After he left, I sat alone in the shop as evening settled around me. The space felt different now, not just because the ownership had changed, but because the future possibilities had expanded dramatically. Instead of managing decline or facilitating sale to developers, I was building something that could last and matter. The challenges ahead were substantial. I needed to rebuild customer relationships that had been damaged by months of impersonal service. I needed to retrain staff who'd been discouraged from developing personal connections with clients. Most importantly, I needed to prove that a 67-year-old woman could successfully run a modern business without sacrificing either efficiency or heart. But as I locked up and headed home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death, genuine excitement about the future. Tomorrow would bring the real work of transformation, but tonight I could savor the satisfaction of having fought for something I believed in and won. The golden years I was learning weren't about graceful retirement from life's challenges. They were about choosing which mountains were worth climbing and bringing a lifetime of experience to the ascent. And I had a feeling that the view from the summit of this particular mountain was going to be spectacular. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd taken full ownership of Willow Bloom. I was in the back room, unpacking a shipment of medicinal herbs I'd special ordered to rebuild the consultation program, when Jazz appeared. In the doorway with an expression I'd learned to recognize trouble was walking through the front door. "Brielle's here," she said quietly, "and she doesn't look happy." I dusted soil from my hands and checked my reflection in the small mirror Robert had hung years ago. The woman looking back at me was tired but determined, her silver hair neatly arranged, her spine straight with the kind of posture that had once commanded respect from rebellious teenagers and hostile school board members. "Send her back," I said. "And Jazz?" "Whatever you hear, don't intervene unless I call for help." I arranged myself behind the desk, hands folded calmly, as Brielle swept into the office like an avenging angel in designer clothing. She'd dressed for battle, a sharp black blazer that looked expensive enough to intimidate, heels that clicked authoritatively against the floor, makeup applied with the precision of war paint. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" She began without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Playing the confused old woman while you plotted to steal my business, your business." I kept my voice level, though my heart was racing. "That's interesting. I wasn't aware you'd ever owned shares in Willow Bloom. I built this place. I turned your husband's failing garden center into something profitable and modern. I brought in the customers, developed the brand, created the systems that actually work. And I funded it. I also funded the expansion, the inventory upgrades, and the salary you've been drawing for 3 years. I opened the folder on my desk and removed copies of the financial documents Harper had uncovered. What I didn't fund was your consulting contract with Marcus Webb or your unauthorized bank account. Brielle's composure cracked, revealing the desperation I'd glimpsed during our final negotiation with Webb. You don't understand the retail business. You don't understand marketing or brand development or customer acquisition. You're going to run this place into the ground within 6 months, perhaps. But it will be my choice to make. Your choice. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're 67 years old. You should be playing bridge and taking cruises, not pretending you can compete in a business that's passed you by decades ago. The ageism was so blatant, so casually dismissive, that it took my breath away. This was what she really thought, that my age alone disqualified me from relevance, that my years of experience were liabilities rather than assets. You're right, I said quietly. I'm 67 years old, which means I've had 67 years to learn about leadership, about building relationships, about the difference between short-term profit and long-term value. You're 34, which means you've had exactly 12 years in the workforce to learn that quarterly earnings reports matter more than customer loyalty. Customer loyalty doesn't pay the bills, doesn't it? Mrs. Patterson has been shopping here for 3 years specifically for the herb consultations you eliminated. The Hendersons have bought all their wedding and anniversary flowers here because David remembers their important dates and always includes a personal note. The small business owners in town use us for their promotional events because we understand their budgets and their deadlines. I leaned forward. Those relationships are worth more than any amount of Instagram followers. You're living in the past. No, I'm living in the present with respect for what's worked before. There's a difference. Brielle began pacing, her heels clicking against the floor or like an agitated metronome. You want to know what I really think? I think you're a bitter old woman who can't stand that someone younger and more capable took over her husband's mediocre little business and actually made something of it. The attack was personal and deliberately cruel, designed to make me doubt myself and surrender the authority I'd fought to reclaim. A month ago, it might have worked. But I'd spent the past weeks rediscovering the strength that had carried me through 40 years of educational leadership, and I wasn't about to be intimidated by someone who confused ruthlessness with competence. What I can't stand, I said, rising from my chair, is watching someone destroy relationships I helped build in pursuit of profits they plan to steal. What I can't stand is being treated like an inconvenience in my own investment. And what I absolutely won't tolerate is being spoken to with disrespect by someone who's been systematically defrauding me for months. Defrauding? That's a serious accusation. Yes, it is. Which is why I documented everything before making it. I placed the bank statements and consulting contract on the desk between us. $58,000 diverted to an unauthorized account. $30,000 in consulting fees for facilitating a sale you weren't authorized to negotiate. Would you like me to continue? For the first time since entering my office, Brielle looked uncertain. The righteous indignation that had carried her through the initial confrontation was giving way to the recognition that she was in serious legal jeopardy. Those were legitimate business expenses and consulting arrangements without the knowledge or consent of your business partners. That's fraud. Brielle, clear, prosecutable fraud. You wouldn't. Try me. We stared at each other across the desk, and I saw the moment when she finally understood that I wasn't the manageable elderly woman she'd been manipulating for months. I was someone who'd fought bigger battles than this, and won. Someone who'd learned the difference between being kind and being weak. What do you want? She asked finally. I want you to accept that Willow and Bloom is no longer your concern. I want you to honor the non-compete clause in your original employment contract. And I want you to understand that if you attempt to interfere with this business or damage its reputation in any way, I will pursue criminal charges. And if I don't, then we'll let the district attorney decide whether your actions constitute criminal fraud. Either way, you'll never work in retail in this county again. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 3 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Finally, Brielle straightened her blazer and summoned what remained of her dignity. You're making a mistake. This business won't survive without modern management. We'll see. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, I never intended for things to go this far. I genuinely thought you'd be happier stepping back. That might even be true, I acknowledged. But happiness wasn't your decision to make. After she left, I sat alone in the office for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The confrontation I'd been dreading was over, and I'd emerged. Not just victorious, but stronger. More importantly, I'd proved to myself that the woman who'd once commanded respect from teenagers and school boards was still there beneath the grief and uncertainty of recent months. Jazz appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea and a concerned expression. Everything okay? That sounded intense. It was. But it's over now. I accepted the tea gratefully. Brielle won't be returning. Good. To be honest, she made everyone nervous these past few months. Like she was waiting for something bad to happen so she could swoop in and fix it. In a sense, she was. But that's finished now. We're moving forward. The rest of the day passed in a blur of purposeful activity. I called suppliers to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by Brielle's impersonal approach to vendor management. I worked with Jazz to redesign the herb section according to customer feedback rather than efficiency metrics. Most importantly, I began the process of retraining staff to prioritize relationship building over transaction speed. By closing time, the shop felt different, more alive, more connected to its community purpose. It would take time to fully rebuild what had been lost, but the foundation was solid and the vision was clear. As I locked up that evening, I realized that the real climax hadn't been the confrontation with Brielle. It had been the moment when I'd chosen to fight for something I believed in rather than accepting dismissal and marginalization. Everything else, the business acquisition, the staff changes, the operational improvements, had flowed from that single decision to reclaim my agency. The golden years, I understood now, weren't about graceful decline or passive acceptance of other people's decisions about my relevance. They were about choosing battles worth fighting and bringing a lifetime of experience to the conflict. And I had a feeling that the best was yet to come. 6 months after that final confrontation with Brielle, I stood in the renovated Willow and Bloom watching Jazz teach a group of teenagers about propagating succulents the workshop was part of. Our new community education program, one of several initiatives that had grown organically from our return to relationship-centered business practices. The shop hummed with the kind of gentle activity I'd always envisioned. Mrs. Patterson was at the consultation station, helping another customer understand the difference between chamomile varieties. David was arranging a memorial bouquet with the careful attention that had made him indispensable to families navigating loss. Theo was in the corner, updating our website with stories about local growers, a project that combined his technical skills with our renewed emphasis on community connections. The numbers told a story that would have surprised Brielle. Revenue was up 18% from the previous year. But more importantly, customer retention had improved dramatically. People weren't just buying products, they were investing in relationships, and those relationships generated the kind of loyalty that weathered economic uncertainty and competition from larger retailers. Mrs. Marlowe, one of the teenagers in Jazz's workshop, had approached the counter where I was arranging the day's special orders. My grandmother wanted me to ask if you still do the custom herb blends. She said you helped her friend with some sleep problems. Of course, what's troubling your grandmother? 20 minutes later, I'd learned about arthritis pain, sleep disruption, and the general challenges of aging with dignity. I'd also created a custom blend of anti-inflammatory herbs and provided detailed instructions for preparation. Most importantly, I connected with another member of our community who needed to be seen and heard this was what I'd been fighting for, not just the right to own a business, but the opportunity to use that business as a platform for meaningful service. The herb consultations, the workshop programs, the partnerships with local artists and growers, all of it reflected a vision of commerce that prioritized human connection over pure profit. "How were you feeling about everything?" Marion asked later that afternoon. She'd stopped by for her weekly visit, ostensibly to check on the legal aspects of my business transition, but really to observe my adjustment to entrepreneurship at 67. Tired, I admitted, but the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from building something worthwhile. "And Theo, how's that relationship healing?" I glanced toward my son, who was photographing a customer's arrangement for our social media accounts. His approach was thoughtful, focused on storytelling rather than simple promotion, a change that reflected his growing understanding of what made our business special. Slowly but surely, he's had to unlearn some assumptions about what business leadership looks like, but he's genuinely committed to being part of the solution. And Brielle, radio silence since our final conversation. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Portland and is working for a corporate floral chain. Probably for the best. That evening, after closing up and saying goodbye to the staff, I found myself alone in the shop for a few minutes of reflection. The space felt alive in a way it hadn't for months before the ownership changed, filled with the energy that comes from purposeful work and genuine community connection. I walked over to the memorial wall that I'd restored to its original location. Near the front entrance, Robert's plaque was back in its place of honor, along with photos and mementos from the shop's history. But I'd also added new elements: customer testimonials, photos from community workshops, artifacts that told the ongoing story of what we were building together. The newest addition was a framed letter from Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, thanking us for the custom herb blend that had helped her grandmother manage her arthritis pain. It wasn't the kind of metric that would impress corporate investors, but it represented exactly the kind of impact I'd hoped to achieve. My phone buzzed with a text from Harper Lynn. "Saw the article in the local paper about your workshop program. Impressive growth strategy. Coffee next week to discuss expansion possibilities." The article she referenced had been a surprise, a feature story about small businesses that were building community connections in an increasingly digital world. The reporter had been particularly interested in the story of a retired principal who'd taken over a struggling shop and transformed it into a community resource. I typed back, "Coffee sounds good, though I'm not sure I'm ready for expansion yet. Still learning to run one location well." But even as I wrote those words, I was thinking about the possibilities. Other communities that might benefit from the kind of relationship-centered retail we were developing. Other women my age who might have business dreams they deferred, but not abandoned. The idea of mentoring other late-life entrepreneurs appealed to me, not because I'd figured out all the answers, but because I'd learned that experience and determination could overcome the age-related assumptions that society imposed on women like me. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been the grieving widow being gently pushed toward irrelevance by family members who thought they knew what was best for me. Tonight, I was the sole owner of a thriving business that was making a real difference in my community. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been sleepless nights worrying about cash flow, difficult conversations with staff who'd grown accustomed to Brielle's management style, and moments of genuine doubt about whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But there had also been profound satisfactions. The customer who'd stopped by just to thank me for remembering her daughter's wedding anniversary. The teenage employee who decided to pursue horticulture studies because of her experience working with our community garden program. The gradual rebuilding of trust with my son as we learn to work together as adults rather than parent and child. Most importantly, I'd rediscovered the woman I'd been before grief and good manners had convinced me to make myself smaller, though. Educator who'd fought for innovative programs. The administrator who'd challenged unfair policies. The leader who'd never backed down from a worthy cause. At 67, I was finally running my own business according to my own values. I was building something that honored Robert's memory while creating new possibilities for community connection. I was proving that the golden years didn't have to be about gentle decline and grateful acceptance of other people's decisions about my relevance. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw the lights on in my kitchen and remembered that Theo was coming. For dinner, a weekly tradition we'd established as part of rebuilding our relationship. These conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest in a way our interactions hadn't been for years. Tonight we'd probably discuss the holiday marketing strategy, review applications for the spring internship program, and plan next month's workshop schedule. But we'd also talk about what we'd learned from the crisis that had nearly destroyed both our business and our family relationship. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. There might be additional locations, consulting opportunities, or partnerships with other community-focused businesses. There would certainly be challenges, setbacks, and moments when the gap between vision and reality felt overwhelming. But for the first time since Robert's death, I was excited about what lay ahead, rather than simply enduring what each day brought. I'd reclaimed not just my business, but my agency, my voice, and my sense of purpose. The golden years, I discovered, weren't about retirement from life's challenges. They were about choosing which mountains were worth climbing and bringing a lifetime of hard-won wisdom to the ascent. And the view from this particular summit was more spectacular than I'd ever dared imagine. It began with the dahlias. The first spring after Eliza reclaimed Willow and Bloom, she woke one crisp morning to the sound of birdsong and the scent of possibility in the air. Months had passed since Brielle's departure, months of healing wounds, replanting roots, and reimagining what a legacy truly meant. Now, as daffodils unfurled golden faces along the garden walk and the lavender trembled in the morning breeze, Eliza rose with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She wrapped a soft shawl around her shoulders and made her way to the greenhouse behind her house, Robert's old sanctuary, long neglected, now reborn under her care. She had spent the winter restoring the structure pane by pane, with Jazz's help and Theo's hesitant but earnest support. It had taken weeks just to clear out the dead plants, cobwebs, and brittle dreams, but now the greenhouse shimmered with life. Dahlias lined the center bench in hand-thrown ceramic pots, vibrant, hopeful, unapologetically bold. They hadn't bloomed yet, but their leaves were lush and their stems stood tall. Eliza reached out to brush her fingers along one of them, whispering a promise only the two of them could hear. "You're going to show them," she said softly, "that it's never too late to bloom again." It wasn't just about the flowers anymore. That spring marked the beginning of Eliza's next transformation, not just as business owner or grieving widow, or even mentor. It marked the arrival of Eliza as visionary. After the confrontation with Brielle, and the quiet legal disentanglement that followed, she had thrown herself into revitalizing Willow and Bloom with everything she had. She restored the herb wall in its full glory, not just to its original state, but expanded with more shelving, customer stories pinned beside each remedy, and a notebook open on the counter for people to add their own suggestions. The People's Apothecary, Jazz had started calling it. The name stuck. But that was only the beginning. In February, she launched the Rooted Revival program, a mentorship and micro-grant initiative for women over 50 who wanted to start or revitalize small businesses, but had been told too often that their time had passed. Eliza understood better than most what that dismissal felt like, a velvet-gloved hand gently nudging you toward irrelevance. The program offered something radical in its simplicity, belief. The first cohort included a retired postal worker with dreams of opening a poetry cafe, a grandmother turned beekeeper reclaiming her family's abandoned orchard, and a seamstress who'd spent decades making wedding dresses for others and finally wanted to open a boutique of her own. Each of them brought stories, scars, and skills that Eliza recognized as precious currency in a world obsessed with youth and speed. She and Jazz spent weekends reviewing applications, often over mugs of lavender tea and fresh-baked rosemary scones. Marion helped write the legal structure and taught pro bono workshops on contracts and negotiation. Theo, still rebuilding his relationship with his mother, used his tech skills to develop a website that featured interviews, progress updates, and fundraising opportunities. The response from the community was overwhelming. Donations poured in, volunteers offered skills. Local news picked up the story. The shop became more than a storefront. Again, it became a hub, a village square. A place where the past and future met in the present, in the hands of women who refused to disappear quietly. Eliza hadn't just bought back her dignity. She was sharing it. One of the most surprising moments of that spring came in the form of a letter. It arrived in a pale grey envelope with delicate handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper, and a message written in an unexpectedly vulnerable tone. Eliza, I didn't know how to begin this, but I knew I had to try. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, what I did, what I believed, and how blind I was to what mattered. You didn't deserve how I treated you. I confused ambition with entitlement and vision with control. I thought I was building something when really, I was dismantling something far more meaningful than I could understand at the time. I heard about the Rooted Revival program. I read the article in the paper. It's extraordinary. You're extraordinary. I know an apology doesn't undo what I did, but I wanted to say it anyway. I'm sorry for everything. Brielle. Eliza read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it between the pages of Robert's gardening journal. She didn't write back, not yet. She wasn't sure she needed to, but for the first time, she felt something settle in her chest, an old ache soothed by something like closure. Not forgiveness, not entirely, but understanding. And sometimes that was enough. The greenhouse became her sanctuary in those quiet hours before the shop opened. She'd sit among the seedlings and write notes for future blends, sketch new layouts for the workshop space, and plan content for the storytelling corner she was developing with Theo. The dahlias would bloom soon. She could feel it. One morning, in mid-May, Jazz appeared at the door holding a newspaper and grinning from ear to ear. We made the cover, she said, breathless. Not just the lifestyle section, the front page. They called you the quiet fire behind a new community renaissance. Eliza laughed, a full, rich sound that startled the finches into flight from the feeder outside. Quiet fire, she mused. I like that. Jazz sat beside her, spreading the paper across the parting table. There they were, photo of Eliza standing in front of the herb wall, flanked by 2 Rooted Revival mentees. Below the image, a headline read, Late Bloomers Take Root. How One Woman Redefined Legacy. One seed at a time, Eliza sipped her tea and let the moment settle around her. It wasn't pride she felt. Exactly, it was alignment, a sense that, for the first time in years, perhaps ever, she was fully inhabiting her purpose, without apology or compromise. The first bloom opened later that week. A brilliant pink dahlia, petals unfurling like a secret finally spoken aloud. Eliza stood before it with her hands in the soil, her heart steady and full. She reached down, cupped the bloom gently, and whispered, Welcome. The weeks following the first dahlia's bloom passed in a rhythm Eliza found both familiar and astonishingly new. Mornings in the greenhouse, mid-mornings at Willow and Bloom, and afternoons filled with mentorship meetings, herb consultations, and more than a few unexpected detours. She was busier at 68 than she'd ever been at 48. But somehow it didn't feel like work, it felt like justice. Like fulfillment, the shop itself had transformed, gone were the sleek, minimalist lines and sterile symmetry that Brielle had favoured. In their place bloomed soft textures, mismatched chairs with stories of their own, and displays designed not to impress, but to invite. Jazz had even helped Eliza install a memory wall where customers could leave notes, photos, or small tokens tied to moments the shop had marked for them, first anniversaries, new babies, bittersweet goodbyes. What surprised Eliza most was the way people responded. They lingered, they shared. They came not just to buy flowers or herbs, but to belong. Some even brought their own ideas. It began with a local baker, Marcy Tran, who asked if she could set up a pop-in pastry cart every Saturday morning. Then came Diego, a high school senior and part-time delivery driver, who shyly asked if he could host a poetry reading once a month to make the shop feel alive at night, too. Eliza gave a firm yes to both without hesitation. By early summer, Willow and Bloom had become less a business and more a movement. One afternoon in June, Eliza found herself reorganizing the apothecary shelves when Theo entered, looking sheepish and determined. He held two coffees and a manila folder. "I'm not just here to check on the website analytics," he said, handing her a cup. "I want to talk about ... My role." She raised an eyebrow, but gestured toward the love seat by the bay window. "Sit. Talk." Theo settled beside her, opening the folder to reveal printed markups for a revamped email newsletter, one that featured customer stories, not just promotions. There were annotated screenshots of their Instagram page, suggestions for more behind-the-scenes content, staff spotlights, and features on local artisans. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how we tell the story of the shop, not just to sell things, but to keep people connected. I didn't really understand that part before. I think maybe ... I get it now." Eliza didn't speak immediately. She was watching him, not the professional marketing pitch, but the man behind the words. Her son, trying not just to fix a mistake, but to understand the wound it left behind. "I was so sure I was helping you," Theo said finally, setting the folder aside. "When Dad died, I just ... I wanted things to be easier for you. I thought if Brielle handled the business, you could rest." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I know you meant well. But kindness without respect becomes something else. Something that takes instead of gives." He nodded slowly. "I see that now, and I want to earn my place here, not just as your son, as someone who can contribute, who's learning to listen better." Eliza studied him for a long moment before reaching out to cover his hand with hers. "You're already doing that. But I'm not giving you an automatic title. You'll start by managing customer feedback and community programming. Jazz will oversee your work. You'll answer to her as much as to me." Theo blinked. "Jazz, she's earned her role as my right hand. And if you want to help me build this next chapter, you'll need to learn from people who understand what we're trying to build." She does. To his credit, Theo didn't flinch. He smiled. "Understood." The following Monday, Jazz showed up with a clipboard and a smug grin. "Congratulations, Mr. Marlowe. I'm your boss." Theo saluted. "Yes, ma'am." They fell into an easy, teasing rhythm that reminded Eliza of how she and Robert used to spar over garden layouts and seasonal rotations. Disagreements were inevitable, but when rooted in mutual respect, even friction could be productive. Summer deepened. The Rooted Revival cohort met every other Sunday in the back garden, where folding chairs circled the fire pit, and ideas bloomed louder than the hydrangeas. One of the mentees, Andrea, had just secured a local art gallery to host her first exhibit. Another, Bernice, was launching her mobile beekeeping school. Already booked for 2 elementary school visits, Liza watched it all unfold with a kind of awe. She had become something more than an entrepreneur. She was a steward of reinvention, an elder in a new tribe of women who refused to be quietly retired. And yet, not all growth was easy. In late July, Eliza received word that the commercial space next to Willow and Bloom, the one Brielle had once intended to absorb into a soulless expansion, had been leased by a national floral chain. Their name, Petal & Co., clean branding, glossy signage, faux rustic interior design. They moved in swiftly, hired young staff in matching aprons, and started advertising fast flower fulfillment with an app and next-day shipping. The town buzzed with curiosity, foot traffic shifted, sales dipped. And for the first time since the takeover, Eliza felt that old fear creeping again. What if heart wasn't enough? What if the world didn't want what she had to offer? The question haunted her through August, casting long shadows over her confidence. She didn't share her doubts with Jazz or Marion or even Theo. Instead, she buried them under spreadsheets, working late into the night, rechecking margins and projections. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they weren't comforting either. She began preparing contingency plans, just in case, and then came the letter, not from a supplier, not from a bank, from a 12-year-old girl named Addison. Dear Eliza, thank you for teaching me about mint and lemon balm. I planted mine and they're growing like crazy. I told my grandma that I want to open a herb shop one day, and she said, I can help her sell jam at the fair first. Also, you made my grandma smile. She said she hadn't smiled that much since Grandpa died. P.S. I named my plant Minty after you. Love. Eliza held the letter in her hands for a long time, before folding it into her pocket. That evening, she walked to the back garden and sat alone beneath the pergola Robert had built one summer with Theo. The grapevines had nearly overtaken it now, curling in wild arcs across the beams like nature's chandelier. She lit a candle and whispered to the stars, You were right, Robert. The heart still mashes. The next day, she added a new board above the register, Letters from the Bloom. A place for community voices, messages from customers, staff, mentees, and now, young dreamers like Addison. Because in the end, it wasn't about competing with chains. It wasn't about faster fulfillment or sleeker packaging. It was about something no algorithm could replicate, the way someone felt when they were seen. Truly seen. By the time the leaves began their slow shift into amber and rust, Willow and Bloom had found its rhythm again. Not the high-velocity, influencer-driven pulse of Brielle's tenure, but something steadier, like a heartbeat rediscovered after long silence. The competition from Petal & Co. had become background noise. The store was sterile, bright, and efficient. They sold the same dozen arrangements week after week, always picture perfect, but lifeless in their symmetry. Eliza walked through once, curious, and left with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, gratitude that she hadn't bent her vision toward that brand of success. Willow and Bloom wasn't about uniform muddy. It was about the stories between the stems. And the stories kept coming. There was Raj, who came in one rainy Thursday seeking flowers for the woman who'd finally said yes to a second chance. There was Esther, 83 and sprightly, who brought her grandsons to buy marigolds for Dia de los Muertos because this is the only place that respects what flowers mean. And there was young Maya, who nervously asked Jazz if she could intern, just to learn how to care for something real. Every story, every visitor, became part of a larger tapestry Eliza hadn't fully envisioned until now, a living archive of community. And that archive grew. especially through the Rooted Revival program. The second cohort launched in September with double the applicants of the first. Word had spread. If you were a woman of a certain age with an unfinished dream, Willow and Bloom could help plant the seed. Eliza held the first meeting in the newly renovated upstairs lofter space once used for storage, now transformed into a workshop and gathering place. String lights twinkled overhead. The scent of cedar wood and clove hung in the air, and 10 women took their seats, hands clasped, hearts open. She welcomed them not as a founder or authority figure, but as one of them. I spent too many years assuming that purpose had an expiration date, she told them. But here's what I've learned. Reinvention doesn't come with a timestamp. It comes with intention. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was sincere. And later, as the women broke into groups to share their hopes and fears, Eliza watched the room hum with possibility. It reminded her of the classroom energy she used to live for, the magic of a space where ideas took root and flourished. One mentee, Vanessa, wanted to start a traveling repair business for vintage furniture. I've refinished every piece. In my neighborhood, my garage looks like the set of Antiques Roadshow. Another, Cleo, had raised 5 kids and now dreamed of launching a culinary collective for women from immigrant backgrounds to share and sell their recipes. Eliza didn't just nod, she listened deeply, and by the end of the evening, her notebook was filled with scribble plans, supply suggestions, marketing contacts, and a quote she'd jotted in the margin: "Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you pass forward." Outside of the shop, other changes brewed. Theo was thriving under Jazz's mentorship. She'd given him structure, clear expectations, and little tolerance for mediocrity. But she also gave praise where it was earned, and Theo had begun to shine. One morning, he presented Eliza with the first draft of their community impact report. "It's not for the board," he said, with a small smile. "There is no board. But I thought the community deserved to know how far we've come." The report was beautifully designed. Photos of customers, testimonials from Rooted Revival mentees, data on how local spending had increased because of shop partnerships. It wasn't just a report, it was a story of resilience, handwritten in blooms and bar graphs. "We should publish it," Eliza said, moved. "Not just here, everywhere." So they did. It went out to subscribers, local newspapers, and on Marion's advice even to a few state officials curious about small business revitalization in underserved communities. The story resonated. By mid-autumn, Eliza was fielding interview requests, podcast invitations, and one letter from a city councilwoman asking if she'd consider consulting on a grant program for older female entrepreneurs. Imagine that. Marion chuckled over cider one evening. "They want you to teach government agencies how to do what you did in one flower shop." Eliza shook her head with a smile. "I didn't do it alone." "True," Marion said. "But you started the fight. That's what matters." There was something else happening, too, quiet, gradual, unexpected. Eliza had started writing again. It began as journal entries, notes jotted at the end of long days, reflections on grief and growth. But they evolved into essays, then personal vignettes, and finally something approaching a manuscript. Theo found it by accident one evening while helping her reorganize office files, notes from the herb wall. He read aloud. "Mom, what is this?" "Nothing," she said quickly, but then sighed. "A memoir, maybe, or a field guide for late bloomers." Theo turned the pages gently. "It's beautiful. You should publish it." "I'm not sure it's ready." "Neither were you," he said softly. "But look how that turned out." She laughed, then deep and full. He was right. By late October, the days shortened and the shop prepared for its Winter Lights Festival. The staff had taken to calling it their soft rebellion against seasonal gloom. Twinkling lights would line the storefront, pine and citrus scents would fill the air, and instead of doorbusters and Black Friday deals, they would host firelight, readings, hot tea circles, and local artisan showcases. The idea, Jazz said, was less chaos, more care. One afternoon, while hanging paper lanterns in the window, Theo asked Eliza, "Did you ever imagine it would become this?" She paused, tying a ribbon carefully. "Not exactly. I imagined something like this. But smaller, softer. I didn't realize how many people needed a place to be seen," he nodded. "It's more than a store, isn't it?" "Yes," she said. "It's a story." As the wind picked up and leaves blew across the sidewalk, Eliza stepped outside to look at the shop as a customer might. Warm light glowing from within, the sound of soft music, the gentle laughter of women planning something brave, she thought. Of Robert, then not in sadness, but gratitude. How he'd planted a seed they both believed in. How his memory now lingered not just on a plaque, but in every person who found comfort in the sanctuary they'd created. Back inside, she reached for a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "What do you do when the world tells you your time is past? You plant something, you wait, and when it blooms, you let it bloom for everyone." It was a Sunday morning. In late November, when Eliza finally allowed herself to pause, the Winter Lights Festival had ended the night before in a glow of laughter, music, and gentle snowfall. She and Jazz had stood at the front door long after the last guest left, steaming mugs in their hands, watching the lanterns sway in the night breeze like tiny planets orbiting something sacred. The shop was closed that day, a rare quiet. Theo had taken Jazz and David to brunch as thanks for their tireless work, and Eliza found herself alone in the greenhouse, surrounded by rosemary, lemon balm, calendula, and late-season chard curling toward frost. She moved between the rows slowly. Not tending or harvesting, just being. It struck her how different this silence was from the silence she'd lived with a year ago. That silence had been hollow, this one was full. Full of laughter echoes, spoken dreams, the murmur of customers telling their stories over tea. Full of love, memory, growth. She reached the back of the greenhouse where she and Robert had planted a wintering fig tree, now dormant, its branches bare but strong. She touched one, then leaned her shoulder against the wooden beam beside it, closing her eyes. "You were right," she whispered. "I just had to remember who I was." In the distance, wind chimes sang gently from the shop's garden pergola. The scent of pine and something sweeter, maybe cinnamon bark, drifted through the glass. Eliza breathed it in. These weren't just herbs and blooms anymore. They were her story made tangible. When she returned to the house, she found a package waiting at her doorstep. No sender listed. Just a name scribbled across the brown wrapping paper. Brielle. Eliza brought it inside and opened it carefully. Inside was a slim book, soft cover, minimalist design. The title, Scalability and Soul, Lessons I Didn't Learn in Time, she opened. To the first page. To Eliza, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope for understanding. What I took from you was more than control, it was meaning. And you took it back with grace I didn't deserve. This book is my reckoning with myself, with the world I thought I understood, and with the women I overlooked because I mistook speed for strength. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." Brielle. Eliza sat with the book for a long while before placing it on the shelf beside her gardening journals and Robert's annotated seed catalogues. Perhaps she'd read it someday, not yet. But the gesture, at least, had weight. Maybe Brielle had found her own kind of growth. Maybe legacy didn't need everyone to return, but only to learn. That evening, Eliza hosted the first planning meeting for the Spring Revival Conference, a new initiative to gather women over 50 who were seeking their next chapter. Not just locally, nationally, Marion would handle the legal framework. Harper Lynn was flying in to facilitate funding panels. Jazz had begun designing branding and event flow. Theo, now officially the Director of Community Engagement, had suggested they hold the event on site in a series of pop-up pavilions and garden tents. We'll decorate them like living rooms, he explained. Not booths, not stages, just conversations. Eliza loved the idea. As she welcomed the planning team into her kitchen, unfamiliar faces now glowing with excitement, she realized something profound. She had not only reclaimed her place in the story, she had rewritten the ending, not into a tidy resolution, but into something fertile and ongoing. The following week, Eliza visited the community garden where her original herb section had once been unceremoniously dumped by Brielle months earlier. She hadn't been back since the incident, but word had reached her that the herbs had taken well to the soil there and that the garden had begun incorporating herbal education workshops for local families. She found the lemon balm flourishing in the corner, along with rosemary, lavender, and a mint bush that had practically taken over an entire plot. A small, hand-painted sign hung nearby, in honor of Eliza Marlowe, who reminded us that what's rooted in care will always grow back stronger. She knelt by the rosemary, touching the stem with reverence. So much of what she'd fought for respect, relevance, the restoration of personal meaning had extended far beyond her own four walls. What had started as a battle to reclaim her husband's plaque had become a movement rooted in honoring voice, wisdom, and years lived deeply. Later that afternoon, she returned to the shop to find Addison, the 12-year-old who'd written her the mint letter, waiting with her grandmother. Addison held up a handmade booklet. It's a zine, she explained proudly, about how to make your own herbal garden. I made it for my class. But then I thought maybe you could put it here. For other kids. Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Of course, she said. We'll put it right on the memory wall. Addison beamed. Her grandmother squeezed Eliza's hand. And in that simple exchange, Eliza felt the circle close, not in finality, but in continuity. That night, Eliza stood alone inside Willow and Bloom one last time before locking up. She traced her fingers along the edge of the counter, the same one where she'd once stood watching Brielle dismiss Mrs. Patterson. That counter was now covered in handwritten cards, gift tags with tiny poems, and a small wooden box labeled Seeds of Gratitude. Take one, plant one. She switched off the lights and stepped outside. The cold air kissed her cheeks. Above her, stars bloomed in the night like constellations reborn. As she locked the door, Eliza turned to the shop, her sanctuary, her rebellion, her gift. You're not just mine, she said softly. You're everyone's now. Then she walked down the garden path past the reclaimed herbs, the memory wall, and the front gate, where two new parted dahlias sat unopened, waiting to bloom. She didn't know what next spring would bring. More growth, surely, more challenges, but also more chances to make the invisible visible, to give women back their voice, to remind people that legacy isn't written in stone or stored in boxes. It's alive. It grows. And at 68, Eliza Marlowe had just begun to bloom. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.